All right, man, peace. So NBA superstar James Harden had an historical night, being the first player to ever have a 60-point triple-double. Of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
I'm Antonita Collins. If you thought James Harden was starting to lose his lead in the MVP race, think again. Last night in the Rockets' win over the Magic, the Beard did something that has never been done. Harden recorded the first 60-point triple-double in NBA history. He also dished out 11 assists. And to cap it off, the Beard also notched his fourth career 50-point, 10-assist game. Take a listen to what he had to say about his record-setting night.
It's a good feeling, I guess. Just try to go out there and make an impact every single night on the game. However I can, whether it's scoring, rebounding, assists, steals.
Look, brother, at the end of the day, the referendum on you is going to be your performance in the playoffs. I've seen enough of James Harden and Russell Westbrook having these legendary, unbelievable statistical performances against the Orlando Magics of the world and the Phoenix Suns of the world. Then they get to the playoffs and they flame out. He's going to get the regular season MVP this year. That has been his focus, and he deserves it. But for the playoffs, that is where he's going to make his fame.
Whatever it is. Tonight, I was doing everything. Second quarter play started off, and first minute, Eric can go. With the coach said, Eric can't go. He said, go get him. And after that, I didn't come out the game. So just whatever it takes to win.
Now back to First Take.
And he had a crispy line for that occasion. What a night from Harden.
Now, you could tell she loves her black man. I mean, the only people who talk about their lineup are so-called black men and the women who love them.
First player ever to get a 60-point triple-double. Rockets on fire, nipping at the heels of the defending champs. We know about Harden's playoff woes, however, Stephen A. Is this season the most pressure Harden has been under in his career?
Well, let me start this for Stephen A. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the season for James. He is going to have to validate the stats that he puts up, and his overall legacy is on the line in this postseason. They have to at least get to the Western Conference Finals, and he has to play well. He cannot have another malfunction like he had in last year's playoffs against San Antonio, where, I don't know, maybe somebody called him and gave him a little keyword that made him shut down. Who the hell knows?
I believe so, and here's why. Because his greatness is no longer deniable. When I look at James Harden, I look at him as the heir apparent to Kobe Bryant. When I look at James Harden, I look at him as an MVP to be. He was number 2 last year, the runner-up behind Russell Westbrook. I look at James Harden as a flat-out superstar who is unstoppable. And now when I view him in that light, regardless of who you have, CP3 or anybody else, at some point in time, at some moment, they're going to go to you, even with CP3 as your teammate, and they're going to say, here it is. Take us there.
Well, the importance of having CP3 on the team is that CP3 is certainly going to take away a lot of the onus that will be on James. That's why I think it puts even more pressure on the both of them to be high-level performers throughout the playoffs. They can't go to the playoffs this year and lose to OKC in the first round or Minnesota in the second round or something like that. They have to get to the conference finals. They have to face the Golden State Warriors. To me, they don't have to necessarily win. For them, they need to win. But in my estimation, James Harden has to be the same guy in the playoffs that he's been in the regular season, at the very least. Now, we know with all-time legends, they raise their game in the playoffs. But James has not even done in the postseason what he's done in the regular season in regards to his impact. He might be putting up the same numbers, but his impact has not been the same.
Take us to the promised land. At some point in time, it's coming down to that. And if you're James Harden, because of what happened last year in that 10-point game, closeout game against the San Antonio Spurs, because of what happened years ago in the final when he was AWOL and it was very, very passive, coupled with his greatness and what we know he can do when he really turns it on, the fact that you now have the best chance that you've arguably ever had at capturing a championship, I view it as this is a lot of pressure for him. Can he handle it? Yes. Do I believe?
Well, don't say he can handle it because he hasn't shown that he can handle it. Can he handle it? We'll see. We'll see.
Believe he will handle it? Absolutely. I have total confidence in James Harden because I'm trying to tell you there needs to be an investigation. That was not James Harden in Game 6 last year. Somebody kidnapped James Harden and had him home someplace, and they stole his identity and wore his uniform. That was not James Harden. I don't believe
it. He had a doubleheader at the club. It got worse.
Well, you know what? That's right.
Maybe Stephen A knows something. Because James Harden, the real James Harden, was certainly not at that game. Maybe he was in a sunken place, quote unquote. Who knows? As I told you, brothers, many of these top level athletes are monarch athletes. They are under proverbial remote control, quote unquote. Believe it or not.
That's right. That's right. Something was wrong. Something was wrong. It was all a setup. You know, but straight out of Mission Impossible.
Yep.
I don't believe it. He will show up, but there is more pressure.
There's actually not as much pressure as there's ever been on James Harden, and not more. Look, the MVP is his to lose after last night. He's the front runner, no doubt about it. And he's such a great player because everyone knew he was very talented on OKC. And then he goes to the Rockets, and Daryl Morey correctly identified an undervalued commodity, and he was absolutely right.
I don't believe that he was an undervalued commodity. I think that in that offseason when he left OKC, that the consensus was that this was a diamond in the rough, that he was going to have more opportunities to score, and you expected him to put up bigger numbers. The OKC experiment with those young guys, that arguably was the greatest performance in regards to drafting that any GM has had in the last, I don't know how many years, maybe since the 80s Lakers. To have Kevin Durant, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, Serge Ibaka, Reggie Jackson, what's his brother's name? The brother who's now on Cleveland. To have them all on this, who had the heart issue, to have them all on the same team based
to the Rockets, and Daryl Morey correctly identified an undervalued commodity, and he was absolutely right. And every year, Harden gets better. He's better this year than he was last year. He was better last year than he was the year before. And 3 years ago, he was an MVP candidate, right? Like the year before last. So he is amazing. I can't say enough great things about him right now. And I've been critical of him in the past when he showed up small in the playoffs or hadn't played defense, etc. But he has not as much pressure even as in the past because he has a legitimate crime partner now.
You know, that's a partially good point. But I think that's the exact reason why he does have more pressure. I think that he has more pressure to succeed. But as far as being on the court, he has less pressure because he has Chris Paul to take a lot of the onus away from him in playmaking and decision-making, especially down the stretch of games. So it's a double-edged sword, but I certainly recognize the validity of some of Max's points there.
CP3, he is playing with someone who, Stephen A., you correctly identified as an MVP candidate this year. CP3 is just about as great as James Harden. And in fact, it's CP3 who played with a pretty good team before and couldn't get out of the second round of the playoffs, right? Could never make the conference finals, joins the Clippers. Man, it would be Lob City. He gave him the name, really, with Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. He joins that team, gets a great coach, the whole thing, never makes a conference finals. And now CP3, who is also playing out of his mind great. CP3, Olympic champion, the guy who really just feels like a winner, feels like a champion.
I agree with what Max stated there in regards to CP3 feeling like a winner. You watch Chris Paul play and you wonder to yourself, how come this guy has never even made the conference finals? In 2015, when they blew that 3-1 lead, I think that was the beginning of the end for the LA Clippers. Because CP3 is one of those guys who he does not function well when he's in an environment that is not successful. Meaning what? He's not someone who's going to rally the troops. He's someone who's going to curse people out. You have certain performers like that, certain athletes like that, whether it be a CP3 or a Kobe Bryant, who, though great, they have to be in the right atmosphere. You have to have the right coach with them. You have to have the right system with them. And I mean, that's pretty much the case for every great athlete. But there are certain personality types where you have to make sure that you can protect them from themselves, because they'll start to cannibalize their own teammates when things are not going how they feel like they should be going.
Player to everyone is on a team with the guy who's going to win the MVP on a team that looks like they're just about as good as the Warriors. The pressure's as much on Chris Paul as it is on James Harden, and because of the presence of Chris Paul, James Harden knows he doesn't have to do it all by himself like he did yesterday in the playoffs.
That's true, but this is still recognized. The Houston Rockets are still recognized as James Harden's team. So it's not like James Harden can go out in the playoffs, say Game 6 in Houston against the Golden State Warriors, down 3-2. You got to win to take it to a Game 7 in Golden State. And James Harden could come out and shoot 6 for 23. And Chris Paul shoots 11 for 20 and has 15 assists. And then James Harden could sit back and say, well, we were both on the same team together, so you can't blame me. No, it's viewed as his team. Chris Paul is not viewed as the alpha on that team. And I think that Chris Paul welcomes the fact that he can play on a team where he does not have to play the role of the alpha. I'm not sure how many assists Chris is averaging this year, probably somewhere around 9 or 10, somewhere in that area. But I'm sure that these are the easiest 9 or 10 assists that he's gotten. And I have to admit, I did not think that they were going to be this successful as a unit, particularly as a backcourt. I thought they were going to be fighting over the basketball. So they have certainly proved me wrong, and their success has impressed me. I thought one of their best games was a game that they lost recently to New Orleans, where they seemed like they were dead in the water, like they had no chance of coming back, and they actually came back. I believe even had the lead at one point in the fourth quarter, the same game where Boogie Cousins went down with the torn Achilles tendon. So they're certainly going to be a team to be reckoned with. I don't think that they're going to beat Golden State, but sometimes Golden State can get a little bit too big for their britches, and I think that's why Steve Kerr was so upset with them in their loss to Utah, where they got blown out, because this is not like a regular Golden State season where they're 10, 11 games ahead of the competition. They're only about 2.5 or 3 games ahead of Houston. And Steve Kerr, I believe, is trying to press the urgency with his squad that you can lose home court this season.
You won't have to do it all alone. So no, not the most pressure ever on James Harden.
Just because you know that you don't have to do it all alone doesn't mean that the eyes of the world and the eye of the storm won't be on you when it really, really counts. See?
Agreed, Stephen A. Agreed. At the end of the day, this is James Harden's team.
CP3 for all his greatness, and he is great. One of the greatest point guards that have ever lived as far as I'm concerned. CP3 has never been to a conference finals. He has never been to an NBA finals. He doesn't play above the rim. He's not the scoring dynamo that Allen Iverson is. He is a floor general and floor orchestrator extraordinaire. He is the guy that sets things up, who parts the Red Sea to make the path for you. Be present for you to deliver. You still have to be the one who delivers. So in the end, what it's going to come down to, Max, is CP3 setting the stage for Harden to be the one to take them to the promised land. And Harden is going to have to be the one called upon to do it.
I absolutely agree with Stephen A. there. I can't say it much better than him, because at the end of the day, Chris Paul is the guest. He's the one who's been brought in to add a little bit, to be that addition. He's not going to get the brunt of the blame, I should say. James Harden will be the one that will have to receive the brunt of the blame, particularly if Houston were to flame out in the first or second round. They were to go out in the first round. That would be an absolute disaster for that team. Even the second round would be very, very bad, but the first round would be a disaster. Could you imagine them as the 2 seed playing a 7th seed in the first round? A team like a New Orleans, or even say if Minnesota were to fall to 7, which I doubt, some team along those lines, and they lose in the first round, then Tony might get fired. So they have to get to at least the conference finals and lose in no less than 6 games. It has to be no less than 6 games, preferably 7 games if they were to lose. Because anything less than that, heads are going to roll. But anyway. All right, man, peace. So I just wanted to add this little snippet onto the video, because it once again confirms a sentiment that I touch on intermittently in regards to many of these high-level athletes, and that is that they are under constant quote-unquote modification, meaning what? They're assets. You'll oftentimes see in many of these sports segments that they'll very cryptically show their athletes, when I say their athletes, meaning their assets, holding up a hand sign, normally the Manu Cornuto or sometimes the Mudra, which is basically the OK sign. You see that especially in the NBA. They utilize many of their top assets in doing that hand sign. And the athlete that we're going to highlight here is Mr. James Harden. I made a video about him and Chris Paul a while ago in regards to them basically just holding up their horns. I've already stated that, in my view, Chris Paul is clearly a initiate, a worshiper, a venerator of the god Pan. His wife has the head of Pan tattooed on her shoulder blade. I think that was one of the reasons why Chris Paul came to play with Mr. James Harden, not only because of his talent, but also because he's in the craft. They're both in the know. Anyway, let's watch here as ESPN shows James Harden holding up the Manu Cornuto hand sign, which they oftentimes tell you is the I love you sign in sign language. But Helen Keller, who developed sign language, or was one of the creators of sign language, the reason why she made that hand sign, the I love you sign, is because she was a theosophist, meaning she was a follower of Madame Blavatsky, who was the top female occultist of her day in the mid to late 1800s. She was the teacher of Aleister Crowley. But let's see how, as ESPN shows James Harden holding up his hand in that sign.
Lost. James Harden goes all for 60 and has the Rockets' red glare in Houston this season. But will the Beard handle the pressure of championship expectations? Keep it up.
And you see what they did there. They also had at the bottom the real King James, an allusion to the King James Bible. In other words, while James Harden was holding up that hand sign to show his worship of the quote unquote Baphomet, or the god Pan, they're saying that is the real God. All right. But anyway, peace.